In this section, we'll be giving some background about Japan. Once again, you can kind of see there's Korea there on the west. To the north, it's labeled as Manchuria. That's, of course, today modern part of modern-day China. In this time period, remember, that's where the Manchus come from. They're going to come down and conquer China and form the Qing dynasty. To the east of Korea, you can see the Japan. And two things I want to note about it is it's an island nation, right? There's divided up into islands, and it also is very mountainous, right? Those are just two kinds of things to keep in mind with the geography. One thing I want to point out that you can see kind of the arguments here. Some of my Korean students, for example, did not like this slide because it uses the title Sea of Japan. The Koreans are like, we use this ocean too. It's not just Japan's. And Koreans call it the East Sea, which of course is also somewhat problematic because it's saying that in a sense it's Korean, right? It's east from Korea, not from Japan. One Korean president suggested naming it I believe the Peace Sea, which I think would be good. Like I wish they would settle on that compromise. But I do want to point that out that it is a kind of controversial issue. Now, but main point here was just to give you a sense, where is Japan? So just like Korea was connected to Chinese civilization, so too is Japan also connected to Chinese civilization. China and Japan are close enough that Japan would borrow Chinese culture. So, for example, they would borrow Chinese writing. If you go to Japan today, you'll see Chinese all over the place. And Japanese people can usually write their names in Chinese as well as in Japanese syllables. They also borrow Confucianism and Buddhism. Originally, Buddhism is from India, of course, but Japanese borrowed Chinese-style Buddhism. But one thing that's kind of cheeky about the Japanese that makes them a little bit different than Korea is that they had an emperor with the same title as China's emperor, right? So remember, the Koreans only had a king. The Japanese would say, well, we're just as good as the Chinese. We have an emperor too. And they use the exact same title. And today, Japan still has an emperor. There's the emperor and his empress. So it's kind of striking that still exists in Japan today, even though it no longer exists in China. Now, why could the Japanese get away with this? Because they're far enough away that China could not influence Japan as much as it did Korea or threaten militarily. Right? So let's look again at that map. Korea shares a land border with the mainland Asia. So the Chinese could invade. The Qing actually had invaded Korea twice to get them to stop being loyal to the Ming. Japan, though, because it's a series of mountainous islands separated from mainland Asia by an ocean, they're much harder to get to. So because of that, they could borrow from China more selectively, and they weren't particularly worried about China being a military threat. So that meant they could be more cheeky and do things like borrow the actual emperor's title. Remember, China said there's only one emperor, it's in China. The Japanese said, nope, we've got one too. And the Chinese didn't like it, but there wasn't anything they could do about it. So this is also important to note that the Japanese felt confident enough to borrow without harming their own identity. Like Korea, they will borrow creatively. They're not going to just copy everything about China. They're going to borrow it and adapt it to their own way of doing things. And you can kind of see that in Japan's government. So you might think that since Japan had an emperor, the Japanese emperor was just like the Chinese emperor because they had the same title. That would make sense, but it's not. Japan had a dual system of government. What do I mean by that? They had their emperor who had a religious role. The emperor's main job was to perform religious rituals. The Japanese, and this is a review from History 121, but I'll repeat it because you may have not taken that. They believed that their emperor was a descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, right? You know, there's a rising sun on Japan's flag. They call themselves the land of the rising sun. That's literally what Japan means in their own language, is land of the rising sun. So it makes sense that they have all this sun imagery because their emperor claims to be the descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So it kind of makes sense for the emperor to have a more religious role. So he took care of the religious side of things. The Japanese also had a shogun. Shogun just literally means general. The word shogun means general. But Japan would develop a system where they had this guy who had a political role and basically ran the politics. So you have the emperor who has a religious role, you have the shogun who has a political role, and to make things even trickier, the shogun was basically a military dictator. Remember, shogun means general. And the way they worked together was that the emperor only had basically one political role. He was supposed to appoint the strongest warrior, a samurai, as shogun. Right? The emperor has just this one political role, appoint the strongest warrior as shogun. So basically the emperor said, hey, I'm descended from a god. I'm actually a living god myself. And I say that this samurai over here, he's the shogun, he's in charge, listen to him. And then the shogun does the political thing. So in China, you had one person, the emperor, who wielded both religious and political power. In Japan, you had two different people, the emperor who did the religious stuff, the shogun who did the political stuff. And this is one reason why they only had one Japanese dynasty. Right? There's only going to be one Japanese dynasty. When you talk about Japan and have to divide it in different periods, usually use the name of where the capital city was. Right? So, and it's because they only had one dynasty. Because if you wanted power, you didn't have to overthrow the emperor. You actually couldn't. Right? I can't overthrow the emperor in Japan because I'm not descended from the sun goddess. I can't come in and say, I'm kicking out the emperor. I'm the new emperor. I'm descended from the sun goddess. You listen to me. They'll be like, no, you're totally not, related to the sun goddess. So in Japan, you had to rule through the emperor. Right? You made the emperor your puppet, but you couldn't become emperor. So if you wanted to govern Japan, you had to control the emperor. And in Japan's case, what happened, it was the shoguns, right? The military who would control the emperor, and they would actually govern. This is completely different than China, right? In China, because of the mandate of heaven, heaven chooses the most moral dynasty to rule. They could even choose people who weren't Chinese, right? Like they did with the Qing, right? They were ethnic Manchus. So anyone, even a non-Chinese person, could theoretically become emperor of China. So if you wanted real power in China, you had to overthrow the old emperor and establish your own dynasty. So in China, they were always changing dynasties. But in Japan, you can't overthrow the Japanese emperor and declare yourself emperor because everyone knows you're not descended from the Amaterasu, the sun goddess. You just have to control the emperor. So because of that, there's only one Japanese dynasty. Right? In Korea and China, dynasties changed because power changed. But in Japan, only one Japanese dynasty. You can't become emperor. You try and control him. So Japan just does its own thing, right? Japan is going to be, even though they're using similar terms to what they use in China, it kind of runs its own show. And also I want to point out, in Japan, you have warrior rule. The dominant class is not the scholars. The dominant class are the samurai. And that's just not how China and Korea work. So Japan is its own unique thing where you have an embrace of warrior rule, even though you're using terminology that comes originally from China. And this is one thing that makes, I think, Japanese history so fascinating.